We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and 4 minutes ago, the balance of power inside the monarchy appeared to change in a way almost no one inside the palace was prepared to witness. Camilla entered the day carrying the authority of her position. She ended it confronting a decision that struck directly at her identity, while Catherine was suddenly placed at the center of an extraordinary transfer. And when the Privy Council's ruling was finally read aloud, the room reportedly fell completely still. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move. Her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair as the final words settled across the closed room, and for several seconds she seemed unable to accept that the decision had actually been made. The Privy Council, a formal body of senior advisors that records and approves certain Crown decisions, had been called into an extraordinary private session after weeks of internal discussion. Now, its ruling was unmistakable. The fictional ceremonial title attached to senior royal representation was being removed from her and transferred to Catherine with immediate effect. The clerk lowered the page, but Camilla asked him to read the final paragraph again. Her voice was quieter now. Charles had not entered the chamber with her, and that absence suddenly carried its own weight. When the wording was repeated, she lowered her eyes and whispered his name. The title was more than decoration to her. It had represented years of acceptance, public survival, and a hard-won belief that her place beside the king could no longer be questioned. Losing it felt less like administrative change and more like judgment. Across the palace, Catherine received a sealed notification of her own. She held it without opening it, aware that whatever lay inside would alter more than her schedule. The document described a permanent transfer intended to shape future ceremonial representation, meaning the public duties and formal appearances through which the monarchy shows who carries authority. This was not a temporary substitution. It placed the future queen closer to the center of the crown's working hierarchy. Camilla finally rose, but the shock had hardened into something sharper. Before leaving, she turned back toward the officials and asked the question. No one seemed eager to answer. Did Catherine know this was coming? The room stayed guarded, and that silence wounded her almost as much as the ruling itself. And suddenly, the transfer felt painfully personal too. But to understand why that question cut so deeply, the story has to move away from the council table and into the lives of the 3 people suddenly trapped inside its consequences. A royal title can look like nothing more than words on paper, but inside a family built around rank, duty, and succession, words can become wounds. For Camilla, the ruling threatened years spent securing a place beside Charles. For Catherine, it created a responsibility she had never publicly demanded. And for the king, it forced an unbearable collision between his wife, his heir's future, and the institution he had sworn to protect. Camilla felt the loss more deeply with every passing minute. The ceremonial recognition she had carried was not simply a formal label. To her, it had become proof that years of scrutiny, resentment, and uncertainty had finally led to a secure place beside the monarch. That was why the transfer hurt so sharply. She did not see it as routine restructuring. She saw it as the crown quietly deciding that the center of royal life could now exist without her authority attached to it. Charles understood that distinction, and the knowledge made his silence even heavier. Catherine carried a different burden. She had spent years building influence, slowly standing beside William, accepting duties without demanding attention and preparing for the role waiting ahead. As the future queen, meaning the woman expected to stand beside the future king when succession eventually takes place. Every new responsibility brought her closer to that destiny, but this one came through someone else's loss. She knew exactly how that would look, and she knew Camilla would feel the humiliation before anyone spoke a single public word. William watched his wife place the sealed document between them. Catherine did not open it for several seconds. Neither spoke. Then she admitted quietly that accepting what had been transferred to me would inevitably wound another woman. The prince listened before revealing something she had not expected. Charles had been discussing what palace planners were calling future alignment for longer than she realized. The phrase referred to reorganizing duties and authority, so the monarchy's working structure matched the next generation more clearly. Catherine looked at him differently after that. William then explained that the Privy Council action had not been created that morning. A recommendation had been submitted weeks earlier, meaning the transfer had grown from an older conflict already moving through palace channels. She immediately asked what had caused it. The future king hesitated because the answer led directly back to his father, Camilla, and a moment everyone involved had tried to contain. Charles already knew which moment it was. So did Camilla. One private royal ceremony had begun with nothing more than a disagreement over precedence, but it ended with a sentence that changed the direction of everything that followed. And behind the paperwork was one moment no one inside the palace had forgotten. A ceremony where a quiet disagreement became the point of no return. The crisis did not begin inside the Privy Council chamber. It began weeks earlier in a smaller room during a ceremony that should have passed unnoticed. There were no raised voices at first, no public scandal, no dramatic announcement. Yet one disagreement over precedence, one refusal to yield, and one sentence spoken in front of senior aides changed the atmosphere completely. From that moment forward, the palace stopped asking whether something had to change and started deciding what. Camilla entered that Windsor planning meeting expecting routine discussion, but the briefing quickly became personal. 3 weeks before the ruling, senior aides were arranging an investiture, a formal royal ceremony where honors are presented on behalf of the crown, and several duties had begun to overlap. Catherine had been assigned a larger part of the program than before. That mattered because palace planners were already shifting more visible responsibilities toward William and his wife as part of long-term succession planning. Gradual preparation for the next generation to carry greater public authority. Camilla noticed the change immediately. She questioned why Catherine was being placed at the center of duties that had previously reflected her own seniority, and the tension sharpened when officials explained that the new arrangement came from broader continuity planning. Catherine stayed measured, but she understood exactly what the objection meant. She was not simply being asked to perform more work. Her growing role was becoming evidence that the monarchy was preparing for a future in which the balance around Charles would look very different. Camilla finally pushed the folder back across the table. She turned toward Charles and said, "If my place can be reassigned this easily, perhaps you should decide whether I have one at all." The room went still. The king did not answer immediately. He looked down at the briefing file, closed it slowly, and ended the meeting several minutes earlier than planned. Catherine left knowing the argument had crossed a line, while Camilla walked away, convinced she had forced her husband to recognize how deeply the change was cutting. Charles reacted differently. Within 48 hours, a confidential review was opened to examine whether one of the Queen Consort's fictional ceremonial designations should be transferred permanently to Catherine. A documented internal account of that review showed that the process did not begin as punishment. It began because the Windsor confrontation convinced advisors that overlapping authority had become impossible to ignore. More damaging still, the monarch was given the chance to stop the review and chose to let it continue. Camilla discovered that detail later through a private briefing from her senior aide. Her anger shifted instantly. Catherine was no longer the only person in her mind. Charles had known. He had permitted the machinery to move forward, and now she wanted an answer from him directly. What began as a dispute over protocol was now a question of loyalty. And when Camilla finally faced Charles without aides between them, restraint disappeared. The confrontation Camilla had been holding back finally came behind a closed door. No council members, no secretaries, no carefully prepared palace language. Just a wife facing her husband and demanding to know why he had not stopped a decision that stripped away something she believed he had spent years helping her secure. Charles had survived constitutional pressure, family fractures, and public scrutiny, but this was different. This time the accusation came from across his own room. Camilla entered carrying the council document and placed it on the table between them without ceremony. The Privy Council review, the formal internal process examining how certain royal duties and distinctions should be handled, had continued with Charles's knowledge. That fact mattered more to her than anything written on the page. She had believed the king would protect the position they had spent years defending together. Instead, he had allowed advisors to examine whether part of that position should be handed permanently to Catherine. Camilla looked directly at him. "You let them take it from me." Charles did not answer at once, and the silence only deepened the wound. When he finally spoke, he insisted the decision was not punishment, it was continuity. The monarchy, he said, had reached a point where future duties had to be made clearer before confusion hardened into conflict. She rejected the explanation immediately. To her, continuity sounded like a polished word for replacement, and she accused him of hiding behind the institution because admitting the personal truth was harder. Charles felt the accusation land. He knew stopping the review now would mean overruling senior advisors and reopening succession planning that had already begun shifting more responsibility toward William and Catherine. Succession planning simply meant preparing the next generation to carry greater authority before the crown eventually passes forward. He also knew that every attempt to soften the decision made Camilla hear only one thing. He had chosen the future over her sense of security. Camilla then asked the question that had been tormenting her since the ruling. Had Catherine personally requested the transfer? The king hesitated, and for one dangerous moment she treated that hesitation as confirmation. Then he finally answered. Catherine had asked for nothing. Documented internal recommendation had come from senior constitutional planning, and he had approved its continuation because he believed the future structure of the monarchy could no longer remain blurred. Camilla went quiet after that. Her anger did not disappear, but its direction changed. Catherine was no longer the obvious enemy. The real force against her was larger, colder, and harder to confront. Machinery of monarchy itself, backed by the husband whose approval had allowed it to move, because behind every emotional confrontation stood a colder question. who actually had the power to make the ruling irreversible. Palaces thrive on ceremony, but power rarely announces itself with trumpets. It moves through signatures, recommendations, precedent, and carefully worded approvals. Camilla could confront Charles. Catherine could hesitate. William could object. Yet once the council's machinery had aligned, personal emotion mattered less than institutional direction. And buried inside the ruling was the detail that explained everything. This transfer had been built to survive anger, embarrassment, and even an attempt to reverse it. Charles sat alone with the final authorization page in front of him. He read it once, then again without touching the pen beside his hand. The process was simple in structure, but brutal in consequence. Senior advisors recommended the reassignment. The Privy Council formally recorded it, and royal approval gave the fictional ceremonial transfer its final force. That last step mattered most. Without the king's approval, the change remained recommendation. With it, the palace could begin treating Catherine's new position as settled. William entered knowing exactly what was at stake. He did not challenge the future arrangement, but he warned his father privately that Catherine could not be allowed to look like the architect of Camilla's humiliation. The prince understood how quickly public perception could turn succession into rivalry. His wife was already the future queen, meaning the woman expected to stand beside him when he eventually becomes king. And that status naturally made her the preferred figure for long-range ceremonial planning. But William also knew that gaining authority through another woman's loss carried a dangerous emotional cost. Charles listened without interrupting. Then he returned to the document and found the clause that made the transfer even more serious. Catherine would not merely receive the fictional title. She would also inherit several duties connected to it, including priority access to ceremonial briefings, representation at selected royal functions, and a stronger role in planning future crown appearances. The change was no longer symbolic, it was structural. The king left his pen untouched for almost a minute. He knew signing would protect the direction advisors believed the monarchy needed, but it would also harden Camilla's belief that he had chosen institution over marriage. William understood that too, and his silence carried its own warning. Still, Charles signed. Within hours, the decision moved beyond paper. Staff instructions changed. Briefing routes shifted. Engagement schedules were rewritten. Catherine's office began receiving material that had once gone elsewhere, while Camilla was about to discover that the loss she feared was far larger than a title. The first true shock was the title itself. The second came when the palace began behaving as though the old arrangement had never existed. The cruelest part of a royal decision is often not the announcement. It is the morning after when the machinery begins obeying it. Names disappear from schedules. Briefing folders change hands. Staff members receive new instructions. Rooms once entered without question suddenly require explanation. For Camilla, the ruling became real, not when she heard the words, but when she watched the palace reorganize itself around Catherine while she was still standing inside it. Camilla received the first revised engagement file before the day had properly settled. Several appearances remained unchanged, but beside one ceremonial duty, the designation that had once accompanied her name was simply gone. An engagement file is the working schedule used by royal staff to organize duties, timings, and responsibilities, and this version made the transfer impossible to ignore. She stared at the empty space for several seconds, closed the folder, and quietly asked her aide to leave. The silence hurt more than argument would have. Briefings that had once reached her office first were now being redirected to Catherine, and staff were instructed to treat the new arrangement as active immediately. That mattered because access to information often reveals where influence truly sits. Camilla could still attend events, still stand beside Charles, still carry dignity in public, but the internal rhythm had changed. The queen consort understood what the paperwork was telling her. Authority was beginning to move before anyone outside the palace could fully see it. Catherine responded with restraint rather than triumph. She told her staff there would be no celebratory language, no private boasting, and no public comparison between her new responsibilities and Camilla's loss. The future queen knew that even one careless remark could turn succession planning into a personal humiliation. She also understood that every folder arriving at her office represented something another woman had just watched leave hers. Catherine then made a quieter decision. Through a private message carried by a trusted aide, she offered to meet Camilla before taking on the transferred title publicly. No press office would frame it. No formal statement would explain it. She wanted the conversation to happen before duty hardened resentment into something permanent. Camilla read the message twice. Her first instinct was refusal. Then she remembered the question she had asked after the council ruling and the answer Charles had finally given her. Catherine had not requested this. She accepted. For the first time since the decision, the two women would face each other without Charles, William, advisors, or council officials between them. For the first time, the institution would disappear from the room, leaving only two women and the question neither could avoid. There were no advisors to translate their words, no husbands to soften the edges, and no palace officials to invoke protocol. Catherine and Camilla met alone, carrying entirely different versions of the same event. One had lost something she believed proved her acceptance. The other had received something she feared would make that loss even harder. Yet, the conversation that followed did not become the explosion everyone expected. Instead, it changed the meaning of the decision itself. Catherine had asked for the meeting before carrying out her first duty under the transferred title. She knew that once the new arrangement became visible in public, every gesture would be read as a message. Camilla agreed for a simpler reason. She wanted one answer without Charles, William, aides, or council language standing between them. For once, she wanted to hear the truth directly from the woman whose name now sat where hers had been. Camilla did not waste time. She looked at Catherine and asked, "Did you want this?" The future queen held the question for a moment before answering, "No, but I will not refuse the duty now that it has been given." The words were calm, but they landed heavily. A royal duty in this context meant an official responsibility carried on behalf of the crown, and refusing it would have created a second crisis on top of the first. Camilla's anger softened, but the hurt remained. She admitted that losing the ceremonial distinction was not the deepest wound. What broke something inside her was the realization that Charles believed the monarchy could move forward without that part of her identity at its center. For years, the position had symbolized acceptance. Now, its removal felt like proof that acceptance had limits. Catherine answered carefully. She revealed through this private conversation that she had already told William any transition involving Camilla should be handled with dignity, not triumph. The prince had agreed. She had never asked him to push for the transfer, and she had never asked the king for Camilla's place. That mattered because the rivalry the palace feared most had not actually driven the decision. Camilla finally understood the difference. Catherine had benefited from the ruling, but she had not created it. The real force was succession itself, the slow, unforgiving movement of authority toward William and the woman beside him. Her anger no longer had one easy target. Then the outside world intruded. Messages were already moving through press offices and broadcasters, and the private understanding between the two women could not stay untouched for long. Inside the room, resentment had softened into recognition. Outside the gates, the world was only beginning to choose sides. By the time Catherine and Camilla finished speaking, the story no longer belonged to them. It had reached television studios, newspaper desks, royal watchers, and the crowds gathering outside Windsor. Every commentator had an interpretation. Every headline seemed to declare a winner and a loser. But one public image captured the mood more powerfully than anything else. Two royal names printed side by side, one crossed by the word removed, the other crowned with Catherine. Charles watched the coverage in silence. What had been framed inside the palace as a decision about continuity was now being sold outside it as a family victory and defeat. That difference mattered because succession planning was supposed to make the monarchy look stable, not divided. Broadcasters described the fictional transfer as one of the clearest signs, yet that more authority was moving toward William and Catherine. While commentators argued over whether Camilla had been administratively sidelined or personally humiliated, Catherine disliked the tone almost immediately. She instructed her staff that her first appearance under the new role must be restrained with no language suggesting triumph, and no attempt to contrast her position with Camilla's. The future queen understood that one careless gesture could turn a difficult transition into open rivalry. She had accepted the duty, but she refused to behave as though another woman's pain was something to celebrate. Outside Windsor Castle, the mood became impossible to ignore. A crowd gathered along the barriers as people held up phones, newspapers, and handwritten signs. Then one front page rose above the others. Crown shifts forward. Camilla out. Catherine rises. The phrase spread quickly because it reduced a complicated palace decision to a brutal public verdict. Some cheered the change. Others called it cruel, and inside Charles understood that no private explanation could control what the story had become. The palace answered with restraint. A short statement emphasized duty, continuity, and service rather than victory, making clear that the new arrangement was being presented as part of long-term royal planning. That wording mattered because it rejected the idea of a public contest. Catherine was not being announced as a conqueror, and Camilla was not being formally cast aside. Still, the symbolism was impossible to erase. Camilla saw the headline, too. This time, she did not react with anger. The private conversation with Catherine had changed something. She now understood that the real force behind the transfer was larger than either woman. And when the shouting outside Windsor finally gave way to silence, the real verdict was no longer about a title. It was about acceptance, succession, and the cost of moving forward. In the end, no council document could explain the human cost of what happened. Catherine gained authority, but not without discomfort. Charles protected what he believed was the monarchy's future, but wounded the woman beside him in doing so. And Camilla lost a title she had once viewed as proof that the battles of her past were finally over. Yet the final meaning of the day was not revenge. It was transition, and transition rarely asks permission before it arrives. Catherine accepted the fictional title without celebration. She issued no personal statement of victory, asked for no special display, and allowed the first new duties to move forward quietly. That restraint mattered because royal authority is not only about rank. it is also about how responsibility is carried when emotions are already raw. The future queen understood that every new privilege now came with resentment, expectation, and the burden of proving that the transfer had been about continuity rather than conquest. Charles faced the consequences inside his own household. In a private conversation with Camilla, he made clear that the ceremonial shift had not erased her marriage, dignity, or place beside him. The king knew those words could not undo the hurt, but he needed her to understand that losing one part of royal authority did not mean losing every part of her life with him. She listened without arguing this time. The anger had burned down into something quieter and harder: acceptance. Camilla encountered Catherine before the first duty under the new arrangement. For a moment, neither woman said anything. Then the queen consort paused and told her, "Do it properly." Catherine answered, "I will." The exchange was brief, but it carried more weight than any palace statement. She finally accepted that fighting the future queen would only turn an institutional transition into a permanent family fracture, while the woman receiving the role understood that respect now had to be earned every day. Charles recognized the cost as well. Protecting continuity meant making decisions that could not satisfy everyone he loved, and this one had changed the emotional balance around him forever. Yet he also knew the monarchy could not remain frozen simply to avoid pain. The title changed hands in minutes, but its real meaning was far larger. One woman finally confronted the limits of the position she had fought to secure. Another accepted the burden waiting ahead, and the monarchy made its choice painfully, deliberately, and finally. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.